The wind was sharp that morning in Douglas, Wyoming. Just off the highway, a sheriff's cruiser rolled to a stop behind a parked Buick. Inside the car, a traveling salesman, Merle Collison, lay motionless. A second vehicle idled nearby, its engine failing to catch, its driver frantic. A teenage girl suddenly broke free from the passenger side and ran toward the officer. She was barefoot, panicked, her voice shaking as she cried out, "It's Starkweather! He's going to kill me!" At that moment, the officer didn't know the full story. He couldn't have. But her name was Carol Ann Fugate, just 14. And the man still fumbling with the car's ignition had already left a bloody trail through 2 states. Within minutes, the chase began. Speeds exceeded 100 miles per hour. Officers fired a shot that shattered a windshield. When shards of glass sprayed into the driver's face, he pulled over and surrendered. He believed he was dying. He wasn't, but 11 others were already gone. The man was 19-year-old Charles Starkweather. What had started weeks earlier with a quiet disappearance in a Lincoln neighborhood was now the center of a national manhunt. But who was Carol Fugate in all of this? An accomplice? A captive? A child caught in something she couldn't control? Before the press, before the trials, before America knew their names, there was only this moment. A frightened girl, a surrendered killer, and a country about to be changed forever. This is the story of a girl many saw as a killer and a boy who left a nation in fear. This video covers events involving real people and real lives. Some of the details may be emotionally difficult, especially for those affected by violent crime or systemic failures. While we will not show or describe any graphic content, viewer discretion is advised. If you're new here, welcome. We create responsible, fact-driven true crime documentaries that prioritize truth, justice, and public awareness. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. To our returning subscribers, thank you. Your continued support helps push these stories into the light, ensuring that names, facts, and lessons are never forgotten. Your likes, your shares, your voice, they make a difference. If you believe that awareness can prevent tragedy, that the truth deserves to be heard, and that every victim's story matters, consider subscribing. It helps us continue producing documentaries that honor victims and challenge the systems that failed them. Turn on notifications so you never miss an episode that could save a life. Charles Raymond Starkweather was born on November 24, 1938 in Lincoln, Nebraska, a city that, at the time, prided itself on modest Midwestern values and a sense of community decency. He was the third of 7 children, raised in a working-class household. His father, Guy Starkweather, worked as a carpenter, but health complications from rheumatoid arthritis led to long periods of unemployment. His mother, Helen, supported the family by working as a waitress. Despite financial instability, the Starkweathers were not known for any criminal history or scandal. On paper, theirs was an ordinary family. But inside that household, and more importantly, inside Charles, something else was forming. From a young age, Charles showed signs of developmental struggles. He was born with genu varum, a condition that caused his legs to curve outward, earning him ridicule and stares from his peers. Coupled with a noticeable speech impediment, Starkweather quickly became a target for schoolyard bullying. Teachers described him as a slow learner, and he often acted out in frustration. But what may have seemed like typical behavioral issues would grow into something much darker. By junior high, the teasing and rejection had calcified into resentment. He found solace in physical education, where aggression could be masked as performance. It was the only subject he excelled in. But instead of forming friendships or seeking approval, Charles withdrew deeper into himself. His sense of identity began to shift. The more he was mocked, the more he cultivated a private world where he wasn't the victim, but the one in control. That fantasy world found its shape in the image of James Dean. Starkweather became obsessed with Dean's portrayal of rebellion in Rebel Without a Cause. He began dressing like him, mimicking his mannerisms, and idolizing his defiance of authority. It wasn't just admiration, it was an internal alignment. Dean was misunderstood, isolated, and fierce. To Charles, that made him heroic. This identity fusion gave Starkweather a framework. If society wouldn't accept him, then rejection itself would become a badge of power. By the time he reached his teenage years, Charles had almost completely disengaged from conventional goals. He dropped out of Lincoln High School in his sophomore year, citing a lack of direction and a growing bitterness toward both students and staff. His relationships with family members deteriorated. According to later testimonies, his father once threw him through a glass window during an argument, an incident that, while isolated, added to a sense of physical and emotional instability in the home. Without prospects, he took a job as a sanitation worker for the Western Newspaper Union. The work was grueling, but Starkweather reportedly didn't complain. He would later say he liked the job because it gave him time to think. What he thought about, however, became increasingly unsettling. Those close to him would recall moments where he expressed a fascination with death, not out of fear, but from a perspective of dominance. It wasn't simply about being alone or angry anymore. It was about power. Though still young, Charles had begun to believe that life itself held no inherent value. If people could hurt, mock, or ignore someone without consequence, then perhaps the idea of consequence itself was a lie. In his mind, the world had already failed him. What grew in its place was a cold certainty that he owed society nothing. By the end of 1956, Starkweather's worldview had calcified into something detached from morality. His behavior, while not yet criminal, had shifted to openly confrontational. Friends noticed his language becoming darker, his tone more resentful. He began speaking in absolutes, about control, about justice, about those who had wronged him. These weren't just angry words from a teenager. They were signals. But no one saw them that way. Not yet. Carol Ann Fugate was just 14 years old when her name became permanently linked to one of the most horrifying crime sprees in American history. Before the headlines, before the courtroom debates, and before America knew their names, she was a junior high school student in Lincoln, Nebraska. Friends and teachers described her as bright, sociable, and polite. She was a cheerleader, academically average, but well-liked by classmates. Nothing in her background suggested she'd one day be sitting in a courtroom facing life in prison. Carol lived with her mother, Velda Bartlett, her stepfather, Marion Bartlett, and her 2-year-old half-sister, Betty Jean. The family lived on the outskirts of Lincoln, in a modest home. There was no record of abuse in the household. Her life, at least from the outside, appeared stable. But everything began to change when she met Charles Starkweather. Carol first encountered Starkweather in 1956 through her older sister Barbara, who was dating one of his friends. Charles was 18 years old at the time, already out of school and working as a garbage collector. Despite the age gap, he quickly took interest in Carol. The relationship developed rapidly. By 1957, they were inseparable. Starkweather often visited her home, though his parents grew increasingly uncomfortable with his presence. Reports later revealed that Velda and Marion had openly disapproved of the relationship, telling Charles he was no longer welcome in their home. Despite those warnings, Carol continued to see him. Friends later noted that she seemed proud to be associated with him. To some, Charles represented rebellion, freedom, and intensity, qualities that may have appealed to a teenager pushing against parental control. Starkweather, on the other hand, saw Carol as central to his worldview. He referred to her as his only light in a dark world. In his own words, she was his only light in a dark world. The psychological dynamics of their relationship became a key point of dispute. Prosecutors would later argue that Carol was a willing participant, that she stood by Starkweather not out of fear, but loyalty and desire. Carol, however, maintained that she had been manipulated and threatened. She insisted she stayed with him because he told her that if she ran, her family would be harmed or worse. The blurred line between teenage rebellion and coercive control was at the heart of the case. Was Carol a hostage, too terrified to escape, or a girl who had fallen so far under the influence of someone dangerous that she no longer recognized right from wrong? As investigators and journalists began to look deeper into her role, it was clear that understanding Carol Fugate required more than surface-level assumptions. She was neither a hardened criminal nor a helpless child. She was something in between, caught in a situation that escalated beyond anything she could control, and one that would forever alter how the justice system viewed youthful involvement in violent crime.
On the night of December 1st, 1957, a quiet gas station in Lincoln, Nebraska, became the setting for the first act of violence in what would later unfold into one of America's most chilling crime sprees. 18-year-old Charles Starkweather entered the station shortly before closing. The clerk on duty was 21-year-old Robert Colvert. Colvert was alone, and what began as a routine customer interaction turned tense. Starkweather reportedly became agitated over a dispute involving merchandise pricing. What followed was not an outburst of passion, but a calculated decision. Starkweather left the station, retrieved a firearm, returned, and forced Colvert to drive to a secluded area. The final outcome of that confrontation was fatal. It would mark the beginning of a series of deliberate acts that would span nearly 2 months and take the lives of 10 more individuals. After this first incident, Starkweather returned to life in Lincoln. There was no immediate arrest. The crime did not draw national headlines. In fact, it remained largely unsolved and disconnected from what would happen next. The delay in connecting that incident to future crimes would prove critical. By late January 1958, tensions in Starkweather's personal life were escalating. His relationship with 14-year-old Carol Ann Fugate was becoming increasingly isolated. Fugate's family, her mother Velda Bartlett, stepfather Marion Bartlett, and her 2-year-old half-sister Betty Jean, had reportedly expressed concern about Charles's behavior and influence. On January 21, 1958, those tensions came to a violent confrontation. That day, Starkweather visited the Bartlett home in Lincoln. By his account, a disagreement escalated quickly. The details of what happened inside remain contested, but by the time the situation had ended, all 3 members of the Bartlett household were deceased. Charles later claimed that Carol was not present during the incident, and that he alone was responsible. Carol, on the other hand, maintained that she arrived later and was told her family was being held hostage, forced into compliance under threat of harm. Following the incident, Starkweather placed a handwritten note in the window of the Bartlett home. The note falsely claimed the family was ill and requested privacy. This simple deception allowed them to remain in the house for several days without immediate suspicion. It delayed intervention. During this time, family members, friends, and even authorities were kept at bay. On January 27th, the pair left Lincoln. Their next stop was the rural home of August Meyer, a 70-year-old farmer who had known the Starkweather family for years. Located near Bennett, Nebraska, the property was isolated, making it vulnerable. Meyer, who reportedly welcomed the visit initially, was found deceased on the property soon after. The family dog was also found harmed, further reflecting the calculated nature of the pair's movements. There was no sign of robbery or forced entry. The motive appeared to be eliminating potential witnesses and acquiring transportation. As they fled the area, Charles and Carol encountered a young couple, 17-year-old Robert Jensen and 16-year-old girlfriend Carol King. The couple was offering a ride, unaware of the danger they faced. Starkweather later admitted to forcing the pair to drive them to a remote storm cellar. There, Robert Jensen was fatally shot. Carol King was later found deceased nearby. Again, Fugate's role was disputed. Starkweather alleged that Carol had a direct role in these events, which she firmly denied. On January 28, 1958, the pair arrived in Lincoln once more, this time targeting a wealthy family known to the community. Chester and Clara Ward lived in a quiet neighborhood, along with their maid, 51-year-old Lillian Fenk. Starkweather and Fugate entered the home with clear intent. What followed was a series of attacks that claimed the lives of all three residents. Witness reports and physical evidence later suggested that valuables were taken and the couple fled in the Ward family's vehicle. Once again, animals in the household were also harmed. The consistent elimination of all present, including pets, suggested a pattern. No witnesses, no survivors. Law enforcement now began connecting the dots. The stolen vehicles, timing, and method led them to identify Charles Starkweather as the primary suspect. Carol Fugate was also named in police bulletins. Panic swept across Nebraska. The scale and randomness of the violence prompted school closures, emergency patrols, and widespread fear. On January 29th, outside of Douglas, Wyoming, the pair's final known victim was encountered. Merle Collison, a traveling salesman, was resting in his parked Buick on the side of the road. Starkweather attempted to take the car, but was unfamiliar with the parking brake mechanism. This delay led to the intervention of a passing motorist and ultimately caught the attention of law enforcement nearby. A confrontation followed. Fugate exited the vehicle, ran toward the officer, and identified Starkweather by name, saying she feared for her life. Starkweather attempted to flee, but was pursued in a high-speed chase that ended when a round shattered the windshield of his vehicle. Convinced he had been fatally wounded, Starkweather pulled over and surrendered. He was taken into custody without resistance. What happened over those 9 days left an irreversible mark on America's conscience. 11 people lost their lives. The age of the suspects, the methodical nature of the crimes, and the lack of motive in many cases would prompt national outrage, psychological analysis, and legal scrutiny for years to come. But the question remained: was Carol Fugate a hostage or a willing accomplice? And had the warning signs been present all along but missed? In the aftermath of the arrest, law enforcement began the complex task of retracing the steps of Charles Starkweather and Carol Ann Fugate. What they uncovered was not only a sequence of violent events, but also a glaring pattern of missed connections that allowed the spree to spiral out of control. Local police departments, initially treating the Bartlett family's disappearance as a domestic matter, failed to recognize early indications that something far more serious had occurred. The note left in the window of the Bartlett home, claiming the family was sick, was accepted at face value for several days. During that time, Starkweather and Fugate had already moved on. As reports of additional homicides came in from different counties, a sense of urgency spread across Nebraska. Investigators struggled to link the crime scenes, which at first seemed random. The geographic distances between the murders and the erratic movements of the suspects created confusion. It wasn't until multiple stolen vehicles were traced and identified in close proximity to several scenes that authorities began to establish a consistent trail. Each car left behind told a part of the story, one abandoned, another freshly taken, each one a marker of the couple's path through the region. Public anxiety reached a boiling point. Starkweather and Fugate were described in newspapers and on radio as armed, dangerous, and unpredictable. Families locked their doors. Schools closed early. Reports of sightings flooded the police switchboards, stretching law enforcement thin across the state. Nebraska Governor Victor E. Anderson authorized the deployment of the National Guard. Civilian volunteers began forming ad hoc patrols. Some towns organized neighborhood watches almost overnight. The manhunt became one of the most intense in Nebraska's history. Meanwhile, the suspects were eluding capture. Fugate, upon her apprehension, told officers she had been held against her will. She claimed she had no part in the killings and that Starkweather threatened to harm her and her family if she did not comply. Officers noted that her demeanor during interrogation was composed, but her statements raised questions about her timeline and level of knowledge regarding the events. Starkweather, on the other hand, offered inconsistent accounts. In initial statements, he implicated Fugate, describing her as willing and even eager to participate. Later, he altered his position, suggesting she was frightened and unknowing. These contradictions made it difficult for investigators to establish a clear narrative. Each interview with Starkweather revealed small details that deepened the mystery rather than clarified it. The forensic process provided the first solid evidence. Fingerprint analysis tied Starkweather directly to several vehicles used during the spree. Items recovered from the abandoned cars included personal belongings of the victims, further strengthening the connection. A .22 caliber rifle and a shotgun, both located near the final crime scene, were matched to bullet casings found at earlier locations. Laboratory tests confirmed that traces of blood found on Starkweather's clothing belonged to multiple victims. This physical evidence placed him in proximity to the crimes and undermined any suggestion that he was merely a bystander or passive participant. Investigators also analyzed timelines, travel routes, and gas station receipts to verify movement patterns. It became evident that the suspects had crossed state lines at least once, complicating jurisdictional control. Collaboration between Nebraska and Wyoming authorities accelerated at this point, leading to more coordinated efforts in piecing together the exact sequence of events. While the forensic evidence painted a compelling picture of Starkweather's involvement, Fugate's role remained less clearly defined. There was no physical evidence tying her directly to the act of killing, but her presence at nearly every scene was confirmed. Prosecutors and detectives faced the challenge of interpreting her intent, state of mind, and credibility. The investigation brought into sharp focus not only the sequence of crimes, but the systemic delay in recognizing a developing crisis. By the time authorities had connected the incidents into a single spree, most of the damage had already been done. The case would soon head to court, but the weight of public opinion was already forming, and it would become just as critical as the evidence itself. Charles Starkweather was brought to trial in May 1958, charged with the murder of Robert Jensen, one of the 11 people whose lives were taken during his rampage. Prosecutors chose this case specifically because the evidence was airtight. Ballistics, fingerprints, witness accounts, and Starkweather's own statements all aligned. The state of Nebraska aimed for a swift and conclusive conviction. In court, Starkweather appeared calm, distant, and emotionally detached. Observers noted his lack of visible remorse, his unfazed demeanor as the charges were read aloud. When asked about his actions, he did not deny them. Instead, he claimed he had acted in self-defense during some of the killings, and later leaned into an argument of temporary insanity. His legal team, led by defense attorney T. Clement Gaughan, attempted to argue that Starkweather was mentally unfit, that his violent upbringing and emotional instability had clouded his judgment. The prosecution rejected that narrative, pointing to the organized nature of the crimes, the sequence of events, and the choices made in each case as evidence of deliberate intent. The jury deliberated for nearly a full day before delivering their verdict: guilty. Starkweather was sentenced to death. There was no visible reaction when the sentence was handed down, no appeal for mercy, no admission of guilt. The execution was scheduled at the Nebraska State Penitentiary. On June 25, 1959, Charles Starkweather was executed by electric chair. He offered no final words. Witnesses described the event as clinical, solemn, and without incident. A final letter addressed to his parents contained no apologies, only a cold reflection on the events, devoid of regret. His death marked the end of the legal process, but not the end of public debate. Carol Ann Fugate faced a separate trial later that year. She was charged as an accomplice to murder. Her defense centered around the claim that she had been held against her will, forced to accompany Starkweather under threats to her life. She testified that she believed her family was alive and being held hostage, and that she had complied with Starkweather's orders out of fear and confusion. Her defense team argued that she was a minor, manipulated, and traumatized. The prosecution countered with evidence suggesting complicity, her presence during multiple crimes, the note left at her home, and her failure to escape or alert authorities. After weeks of testimony, the jury found her guilty. She was sentenced to life in prison. In 1976, after serving 17.5 years, Fugate was released on parole. Her case has remained controversial ever since. Multiple efforts to secure a pardon have been denied. To this day, she maintains that she was a victim, not a participant.
News of the arrest spread faster than authorities could manage. By the time Charles Starkweather was in custody and Caril Ann Fugate had been separated for questioning, headlines across the Midwest had already branded them. Teenage lovers on a killing spree, read one. Child accomplice or cold-blooded killer, asked another. The media coverage was relentless. Local papers, wire services, and national radio networks competed to frame the narrative first. The couple's age and appearance fed public fascination. Their faces were everywhere, mugshots on front pages, sketch renderings in court, and photos from better days now frozen in contrast to the crimes they were accused of. The story wasn't just covered, it was repackaged, dramatized, and amplified. Editorials focused on declining youth morality. Radio hosts debated whether modern music and movies had glamorized violence. With limited verified details released in the early days, speculation took over. Caril Fugate was often presented as either a manipulated child or a calculating accomplice. Few stopped to consider nuance. Fewer still paused to question how a 14-year-old had been so closely tied to such a series of events without raising earlier red flags. In the years following the trial, the case's influence stretched beyond newsprint. Hollywood seized on the narrative. The 1973 film Badlands, loosely inspired by the case, depicted a disaffected young couple on the run, romanticizing aspects of the spree while distancing itself from the real victims. In music, Bruce Springsteen's 1982 album Nebraska included a haunting track that reflected the perspective of a remorseless young killer, echoing lines attributed to Starkweather during interviews. Both works kept the cultural memory alive, if not always with accuracy or accountability. Decades later, public opinion on Fugate remained deeply divided. For some, she was a tragic figure swept into circumstances beyond her control. For others, her continued denial of involvement was hard to reconcile with the facts. The 2023 docuseries The 12th Victim reignited national interest, presenting evidence that challenged how the justice system, the media, and the public treated her. The series questioned whether Caril had been failed by a society more interested in outrage than in the truth. While the trial had ended long ago, the conversation never fully stopped. This case became more than a courtroom headline. It became a cultural reference point, a mirror to the way America processes crime, youth, and justice. Long before Charles Starkweather's name dominated headlines, warning signs were already present, but they were quietly dismissed, overlooked, or misread. Starkweather, by multiple accounts, struggled with social isolation, emotional volatility, and behavioral instability. His progression from bullied child to increasingly aggressive adolescent wasn't subtle, but there was no documented intervention from educators, medical professionals, or community figures that might have disrupted the path he was on. Despite a growing pattern of concerning conduct, including violent outbursts and disturbing statements, no school counselor, employer, or law enforcement authority ever initiated formal evaluation or referral for mental health support. There were no known psychological assessments, despite visible signs of antisocial behavior. In the absence of structured oversight or preventative action, Starkweather's worldview darkened unchallenged. Caril Ann Fugate's situation raised equally pressing concerns. At just 14, she became entangled with an older individual exhibiting controlling and erratic tendencies. Neighbors and school officials were reportedly aware of her relationship with Starkweather, but there were no documented inquiries into its appropriateness or into the shifts in her behavior that followed. Her sudden withdrawal from school and public life during the period of the crimes went unreported and unexamined. Critically, no agency or community mechanism was in place to monitor or respond to these overlapping red flags. There was no cross-communication between schools, social services, or local authorities that might have flagged either individual for risk assessment or protective intervention. The systems that should have noticed, those designed to safeguard both youth and the community, remained silent. This failure underscores the need for vigilance, especially when young individuals begin showing behavioral changes or become involved in relationships marked by imbalance or control. Teachers, caregivers, and community members must be trained to recognize patterns that, while not always alarming in isolation, can form a dangerous trajectory when left unchecked. This case, while specific in its circumstances, reflects a broader lesson. When responsibility is fragmented, prevention collapses. The absence of early coordinated response allowed a preventable crisis to unfold uninterrupted, until it was far too late. This wasn't just a killing spree. It was a warning no one listened to, a breakdown of judgment, accountability, and the very systems designed to protect the innocent. 11 people died, not only because someone pulled a trigger, but because too many people stood by in silence. If this made you uncomfortable, it should, because silence is part of the problem. And if you're watching this, knowing these failures can happen again, and you still scroll past without subscribing, ask yourself, what kind of awareness are we choosing to ignore? Subscribe, not because we asked, but because the next warning sign might be closer than you think. And if you're not going to subscribe, go to the comments and tell us why. Say it clearly so the rest of us know who still thinks this kind of story should stay in the dark. Some stories don't need permission to be told. They need witnesses. Be one. Subscribe now.